Hi everyone, this is the third video in a series of 6 over the UIS IRB application. Today we're going to discuss section 3, which is the protocol/study design. So for this first part, which is 3A, it asks for the title of your study, which you've listed above. So you can literally just copy and paste that here, which is what I've done. So my title is Case Study of Leadership and Management Styles in Local Nonprofits from Springfield, Illinois during COVID-19. So as you can tell here, my title is pretty encompassing of the type of research I'm going to be doing. Underneath of that is where things start getting a bit more detailed. So in section 3B, it asks you for your protocol details and says, in lay language, summarize the goal, objective, and significance of the research. So you'll have to fill in several text boxes here to accomplish summarizing the goal, objective, and significance of your research. So that first text box under 3B asks for the hypothesis or research question. So whatever your hypothesis is or whatever question you're interested in answering, you'll list that here. So for mine, I've put, how are different leadership and management styles contributing to the challenges nonprofits in Springfield, Illinois are facing during the COVID-19 pandemic? So it's a pretty concise research question. You can list one, you can list multiple, it doesn't really matter. We just like to know what exactly you're hypothesizing or what question you're going into your research with. The second text box under 3B asks for the objectives or specific aims. For mine, I've put to interview 5 through 10 interviewees to better understand why their leadership and management styles are contributing to the challenges they are encountering as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So the main thing with objectives here is you want to start with this word to, which is what I've done here. And I've tried to be specific in my objective or aim. So I've listed, for example, that I'm going to be doing an interview, and I've included the exact amount of interviewees I'm hoping to interview, and I've explained what the purpose of that interview is. So I think really the key idea here is putting the word to. You can indicate what sort of research protocol you have here if you feel it's necessary. For mine, I'm not sure that there's really any other way to get around it, so I've put, to interview. And I've put a specific target number. That's helpful at times to really specify what your objective or aim is. And then I've also included, more detail, like what I'm really trying to accomplish here, like what the purpose of this objective or aim is. So having that purpose really helps too. And like before, you can have as many objectives or specific aims as you need to. I've just focused on this one. All right, so that third text box then asks for research procedures and methods, and it asks that you put them in the order they'll be completed. So for mine, I've put that I plan to recruit participants by posting an advertisement on social media sites, specifically Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and Reddit. Then I will send participants the consent form. Then I'll complete the interviews. Then I'll identify the themes in the interviews. I'll complete a research article. And then I'm going to submit to conferences and this article for publication. So when you mention your procedures here, so I've, mentioned how I'm going to recruit my participants. So you can start there if you'd like with recruitment. I've mentioned that I will send those participants the consent form. So you'll want to mention something about consent if your study requires it. And then, of course, my research method here is conducting interviews, so you can mention that. And then I've put my data analysis plan in here, which is to identify the themes from the interviews. So you can mention that data analysis plan there. And then, of course, I'm going to write this up, so you'll want to mention that. And then I assume the goal for most folks is going to be submitting to conferences and or an article for publication. If, for example, you're a student who's doing this for, your thesis or your dissertation, you could probably put, you might be submitting to conferences or maybe for publication, but you also want to mention that you're using this to defend your thesis or dissertation. So the fourth text box asks you to describe the expected benefits of the research to society. So for mine, I've put the expected benefits of this research include raising awareness of how some leadership and management styles are contributing to issues in nonprofits posed by the pandemic, and hopefully leading to improved work conditions for employees of nonprofits in general. So again, it's really just thinking about, what the benefits or like the larger significance of your study is going to have. And I think it's important to mention here too that for expected benefits, you don't want to mention anything about monetary gain for your participants in this because that should not be the main draw for benefits for them. So you want to think a bit broader here. What is and going back to your purpose and your objectives or specific aims, what are you hoping to really get out of this study, and how is it going to help more people broadly? So that's what I've put here. So we're on number 5, I believe. So the 5th text box here asks you for your data management strategies. And it has, for example, who will have data access, where will data be stored, when and how will data be destroyed. So you want to touch on all these. So I've put, I will have access to Zoom transcripts because that's, how I'll be conducting the interviews, which will then be destroyed once the themes are identified. They will be stored on personal computers with password protection. So I've included that I will be the sole person who has access to these Zoom transcripts. So if you have a research team, you'll want to say, my team and I, or you can list the specific people if you'd like to, but you want to mention who exactly is going to have access to that data. And then you want to mention where it'll be stored. So I have here on personal computers. Some people like to put, store it on a personal computer on Box or Google Drive. You can mention that's an online storage. You just want to make sure that you have this next part, which is password protection, or, in some way that it's protected so that only you or the team that you're working with can view that information. So that covers this section. And then text box number 6 for 3B asks you for your data analysis plan. So I kind of touched on this above, but I'm going to identify common themes from the interviews I'm conducting. So again, once you collect this data, how are you going to analyze it or break it down, for, the purposes of your study? So if you're doing an interview, you probably, will do kind of what I did and break it down into common themes, for example. Once you have your data analysis plan, you want to mention your dissemination plan. As mentioned above, more than likely, this is going to be submitting, a paper to a conference to present at, or you might be submitting it for publication. Or if you're a student, you might be, hoping to show this at STARS, for example, as, a research poster or presentation. Whatever the dissemination plan is, you want to mention that here. But more often than not, it's going to be conference and publication. Underneath of that, you want your bibliography. And when we say bibliography, it's just literally mentioning or listing the sources you plan on using. So I've put a whole bunch here that I pulled from our library's database. So that might be a good place to look if you need more sources. But if you're using, scholarly, popular, primary, secondary sources, you want to mention all that here. All right. And then this actually concludes our section 3B. So we're going into 3C now. So we're going to list all the locations where research will take place. I put here physical interviews will occur in public locations of the participants choosing, but I actually am going to encourage them to mostly, participate via Zoom. But if you have the physical locations already planned out, you can actually mention those. So if you're like, I'm going to, conduct interviews at this specific location, maybe it's at the University of Illinois Springfield, you can mention that here. If you're going to do something, virtually, so if you want to conduct interviews on Zoom, you can mention that like I did. Wherever you plan on really doing the research is what you want to put here. And then for 3D, you'll want to list approximate study dates. Mine actually blanked out on me because I had this in here before, but we'll just say, 7/26, which is today, and let's just say that I'm going to do it until, we'll say September 1st, 2022. So you want to list those approximate study dates. It should be a reasonable timeline. I think for my purposes, 5 to 10 people is probably pretty reasonable for the almost month and a half time that I'll be interviewing people. Then under 3D, we have 3F, which asks you to select all research methods and or data sources that apply. So as mentioned above, I'll be conducting interviews, so I've marked that here. And then I'll be recording since I'm conducting Zoom interviews. So I've marked recording audio and or video and or taking photographs. But whatever makes sense for your research study, you'll want to mark here. So if you're doing interviews, for example, but you're doing it on focus groups, you would mark that in addition to interviews and possibly recording audio and or video and or taking photographs. If you're doing a survey or a questionnaire, for example, you can mark that, and then you'll want to just mark whether it's a paper survey or a survey over telephone or online. Online seems to be the more popular option these days, especially with social media sites. But whatever it is, you'll want to mark that. So once you have that marked, then that brings you to 3G, which asks you to list all testing instruments, surveys, interview guides, etc. that'll be used in this research. I'll be using an interview guide since I am conducting interviews, but if you were doing surveys, for example, you'd probably mention, what program or software you're using for those surveys, so you could list that here. And then you'll want to attach the drafts or final copies of all research materials and then mark it. So for my interview guide, I'll attach that. If you're doing a survey, you'll want to have a printout of the questions and then attach that. And then for 3H, it asks you to indicate if your research includes any of the following. So secondary data, deception, data collected internationally, and or translated documents. Our study here isn't international. We're not using deception, and we're not using secondary data, so I haven't marked any of these. All right, so that concludes this video. In our next video, we'll discuss section 4 through section 6.